What's up, peers, and welcome to Bitcoin to the Max here on the World Crypto Network. Let's hack Bitcoin. Let's kind of break it. Let's use it in a way that it might not be intended to be used. Let's try out the Opendime. Well, initially, right, how Bitcoin is actually intended to use is with the application of elliptical curve digital signatures. So we have a key pair of Alice's private key, a non-scarce piece of information that she should retain for herself, right? And when she wants to make a Bitcoin transaction, then she signs a transaction with her private key and publishes this signed transaction with the signature and the public key that is corresponding. And then Bob can verify that the corresponding private key has signed this transaction without actually knowing the piece of information, which is the Bitcoin private key. However, if Alice does not want to make a Bitcoin transaction in the inherent sense and sign with the private key, what she could do is generate the private key, put some Bitcoin on there, and then write this private key on a piece of paper and give it to Bob. Well, what has she just done? She has propagated a non-scarce piece of information to Bob. Well, now, of course, Bob is in possession of this information and he could utilize it and sign a Bitcoin transaction. However, can Bob be sure that Alice would never use her piece of information that she has still retained due to its non-scarce nature? And can Bob be sure that Alice is not herself going to sign a Bitcoin transaction and spend the money to a new private key, which, again, only she knows? Well, this is quite a tricky problem, right? This is the problem that Bitcoin is actually solving, the double spending problem, creating scarcity. However, well, the smart folks over at Opendime actually have found quite an interesting solution. Let's imagine that you buy a piece of hardware, the Opendime, which is a small USB stick that you can plug into any computer, any hardware. And once you plug it in, a key is generated, a private key, and the corresponding public key and Bitcoin address. However, the private key itself stays on this Opendime. It stays on this hardware. And it is in no shape or form being released to Alice. So Alice is not in possession of the non-scarce private key, but she is in possession of the very scarce Opendime stick. And because she does know the corresponding address, she can send a couple Satoshis onto the private key, which is locked into this Opendime. And now what Alice can do is hand over this physical and very scarce Opendime over to Bob. And as soon as Bob has this Opendime in his control, in his ownership, then he can verify for sure that Alice does not have access to the private key because it is still only on this device, only on the Opendime. And then Bob can plug the Opendime in and see the corresponding address and verify on the Bitcoin blockchain if actually a signed transaction has shifted some coins onto this address. And if yes, then he can hand Alice over the coffee that she just bought from him. And this can go further. Now Bob is in possession and he has ownership over the Opendime. And he can hand it over and grant ownership rights to Charlie in exchange for a couple of apples. And Charlie, again, can verify if the key is on this Opendime and if Bitcoin are on the corresponding address. However, of course, eventually, someone wants to make a true Bitcoin transaction and sign a transaction with the actual public private key that was generated in this Opendime device? Well, the only possible way of releasing the private key out of this physical device is by physically breaking it, by chipping away a little strip of hardware, of plastic, out of this Opendime. And once it is broken open, then the private key, this piece of non-scarce information, is released into the wild, because information longs to be free. And, well, Charlie is in possession of the Opendime, and he breaks it, and now he has access, and he knows the information of the Bitcoin private key. And he can sign a regular transaction and actually use Bitcoin as it was intended and spend these private keys or these Bitcoin corresponding. And now if he would hand over the already broken device to David, saying that, hey, David, here are these Bitcoin. It's on the Opendime, right? Give me your coffee. Well, thing is that Dave can verify for himself now that this device actually has been tampered with. It is broken open, and thus the private key has been released. He doesn't know who has access to these information, right? Anyone could have. The entire world could have. But he knows that it is no longer a secret. Thus, David would most likely not accept these Bitcoin as valid, and he would most likely not give Charlie the chocolate or whatever else they're trading for. And so this is the novel approach that Opendime is using to, well, hack around the non-scarce aspect of Bitcoin and make sure that you can actually transfer the private key in a trustless manner, which is fascinating to say the least. Piers, thank you very much for joining me here on Bitcoin to the Max. And this show is brought to you by you, the peers of the World Crypto Network. And thanks to your gracious support on patreon.com/WCN and teleco.in/HillebrandMax, you get early access to these shows. Piers, it's been a pleasure. And hold on to your very non-scarce Bitcoin private keys.